Okay, like I said, I'm sitting here and I get all sorts of ideas what to talk about. Let me say, I can't remember if I already talked about it, but how did my parents, we lived in a house which was supplied to my father from the city. We had chickens and dogs and cats and rabbits and all sorts of other animals, a goose and so on. We had a big yard. Of course, we were living right next to the forest. There was all yard, and so uh, the house, like I said, it was at the edge of the forest, and underneath the house, not to our knowledge at the time, was a spring. Like in other words, there was let's for let's say it was a creek running under the house, water, yeah, and so moisture was coming up, and because the houses weren't very insulated or say anything, so in the stone, of course, soaked up the water, and it went crept up the wall. Now, my parents had had their bedroom was right above that, and my mother kind of often had to scrape off the mold off the walls. And at those days, I'm talking about 19, 19 early 1960s, 50, late 50s and early 60s. So of course there was not much, not as much knowledge around to the normal public about the dangers of mold, and so they slept in their bedroom for 20 years or whatever it is, every night 8 hours, and my father had an afternoon nap in there. So so that was, but they didn't worry much. Okay, that stuff was on the wall. They scraped it off, and eventually it might the room get painted again, and then it's scraping it off again. So that of course affected their health, and then they both died at a very early age. My mother was 40 and my father was 48, and I think my mother died in, what is it, 65 or 66, and my father in 67. That's, I think that was it's around that time. um, and so we kind of now, at the time I was 20 or something. I was, yeah, and I didn't pay much attention to it because I had lots of other things going on in my life, and I was also then in the army. I was an apprentice and I was in the army, and so like there was lots of things for me to do, so I had no time, and so consequently I didn't know. I just knew that my mother was sick. She got a breast removed at one point, and I basically knew that, but didn't talk much about that. It was not to talk. And my father had, I think, a kidney removed, as far as I know. My brother probably would correct me. I don't know. And then and so at the time it was, if you had cancer, you had another 5 years to live, because it would spread, and it's 5 years. So that was, and they both held out for 5 years, kind of things, but they knew it's coming. The cancer would spread, and they eventually would die. And I remember there was this time, where there was a very sad Christmas because they knew that it was their last Christmas together. The theory was that my father would die first and then my mother. Eventually it came the other way around, but I remember my mother went into hospital and she had yellow fever, they said. I got no, I didn't have enough, and I didn't. I just, thinking about it today, I just don't comprehend. I didn't. It just didn't set down on me. Okay, I was so oblivious to the whole thing. Um, and I visited her once or twice and didn't know what to make of it, and eventually I got the notice, or we got the notice, that she died. That was it. So we went to the funeral. My father, I think I was in the army when my father died, um, and I visited him once. And the only thing I can remember, he was in the hospital, of course, in his last kind of few weeks, and I visited him, and the only thing I was remember, he complained to me that he couldn't have a bowel movement. It was very hard for him to have a bowel movement, so that was the big impression I got. But anyhow, so eventually I got the notice in the army, I think, that he died, and so I went home, and to the my relatives were all shocked, because normally when at a funeral you wear black. I kind of wore a nice light cream suit, or pants and jacket. I can't remember. It wasn't a suit actually. And it was kind of, why aren't you wearing black? I said, well, let's put it this way. My father was very religious, not overbearing or anything like that. He never talked about it, but I know he went to church all the time and things like that. And he would, in church, he would read the Bible because he had a very good voice and he could very well read. It was very read. He had big library at home, and he and the priest said, like, why don't you read out of the Bible in service at 7 in the morning? He would always go to the first service, and so I knew, and that for him it was a relief. Dying was for him to go to heaven and be with Jesus and God or whatever. So for him it was a blessing, and so I kind of said, okay, well, honor that, and we don't have to be sad for him because he is where he wants to be. So that's kind of, and then we were orphans, and my grandparents, my mother's parents, they had where they had the cafe, and I think I described that before. There was then a third floor on the building where we moved in. My brother Hubert and Maria moved in the kitchen. We just put the kitchen into a little bedroom, and Hubert and I had to live in the same room, but I was in the army at the time, so I was only there on the weekends. That was okay. And Hubert at the time was learning to be a pastry cook, I think, in the same building with my grandfather, so that was okay. So that was good. The only problem was my sister, who was at the time 12 or 13 years of age. She was very spoiled by my father because he always wanted to have a girl, and there it was, and so he spoiled her rotten. So when we came and lived with my grandmother, she was a disciplinarian. Oh my God, my poor sister. I feel sorry for her today, but at the time, I couldn't. That's what you say to your grandmother, and I'm never there, so I don't know. So that was kind of pretty bad for my sister. I was fine because I was my grandmother's favorite, and I couldn't do anything wrong. I could have murdered somebody in front of her, and she would have found an excuse for it. So I was lucky in that regard. So I was very privileged. So and Martin, my father had bought a house right next to the church, to our local church, and a small house, and there was a laundry area in the bottom of it, and then there was just one floor, I think. It was just a tiny little house, and my brother Martin moved in there, so he was living in there until later on it was sold. So that was just after my parents died. It was kind of a tough time for my sister mainly. For me it was fine. I got my father's car, and I was hardly ever there anyway, so it was pretty okay. Can't remember. Okay, so that was it about that. Okay.